We won't meet for the entire class session today because we don't have enough material to discuss. We're going to do some small in-class readings. I'm going to go over the syllabus and the formal course requirements, have you guys introduce yourselves, and probably finish up around 5:15, something like that. So normally we'll take a break midway in class, but today we'll just go straight and then adjourn. Okay, so let's start with the syllabus. Oh, locked me out already. And I'll introduce myself. So I'm Chris Cutrone, I'm the instructor for the course. What can I say about myself? So I teach in art history, theory, and criticism, but also in visual and critical studies. And my area of expertise is Marxist critical theory. So critical theory, but capital C, capital T, critical theory. We'll see what Robert Pippin has to say about that in the reading that we have for today. So the left Hegelian Marxist and Frankfurt School tradition, that's my area. And so I did my scholarship, my academic work on Theodore Adorno, who we're going to be reading in this course, but also on Walter Benjamin, who you guys have probably read some of, maybe. The work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction is usually standard. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from. This course, so the courses that I teach most frequently and over the longest period of time are my courses on Adorno and Benjamin. But this course I conceived of as like a kind of everything you need to read before you read Benjamin and Adorno, right? The foundations for it. And so it's a meat and potatoes course, or I don't know, my colleagues have described it in various different ways. Basically, they don't want to teach this stuff, so I do. So the purpose of the course is to introduce you guys, familiarize you with thinkers, philosophers who are often referenced but seldom read. So in fact, in reading this material, you will distinguish yourself from most faculty who have not read it, in fact. So it's a very old-style education. My own pedagogical philosophy, just to let you guys know so you have a sense of the person I play as a professor in class, I'm the advocate for the readings. So I'm the defense attorney for the readings, for these particular readings. And for the authors, but merely for the readings that we're doing, more so than the authors. So I will defend them in court against all criminal and civil accusations. I will also, failing that, represent them on appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court and all the way up to St. Peter at the pearly gates, saying my clients deserve admission to heaven. All right, so that is, in other words, I'm going to defend them to the hilt. And the point of that is to get you guys to take them seriously. Right, to have you guys engage with the strongest case that they can make and the strongest reading that is available for this material. So it's very different from the kind of postmodernist, masters of suspicion kind of approach of like be skeptical of everything and these are dead white men and white settler colonial discourse. No. We're not going to do that. Also because it will cut against, even if I were teaching some reactionaries, like Martin Heidegger, an actual Nazi, I wouldn't want to go there. However, it's particularly with the substance, with the material that we're dealing with in this course in particular. So I don't only teach things that I'm sympathetic to. I largely teach things that I'm sympathetic to, but I also teach things in other courses that I'm not so sympathetic to. But I represent them the same way. So that's just to give you a sense of like the psychology, right? The kind of emotional dynamics that we might have in the classroom, because otherwise it might be confusing for you guys. So The course is the Philosophy of Modernism. You'll notice that it has a proper title, however, Critical Art, the Philosophy of Modernism. So they didn't like critical art as the title for the course, but I still keep it on my syllabus that way. Meaning, what is the modern conception of art such that art is critical in character? And this is a much abused term. So I actually did my studies and started teaching long before criticality. I don't know if that's a word that people use anymore. Hopefully it's gone in and out of style, in and out of fashion already. So it's gone already, hopefully, because I don't like that kind of faddish stuff. But criticality had a fad for a little bit, and I didn't like that idea because it was sort of, it actually lacked the substance and was jargony. And modernism is also going to be introduced in a way that might be unfamiliar, because I think that especially the intellectual culture, the intellectual environment, the academic environment coming after the New Left in the 1960s truncates history in a particular way. So modernism for them is usually official institutionalized modernism. It's like Museum of Modern Art modernism. It's MoMA modernism. That's not the way that we're going to be dealing with it in the course, because we will be actually going further back historically into the 19th century. So rather than thinking of the 20th century as modernist and then the 60s generation invents postmodernism, something like that, which would place the height of modernism in the post-World War II era, in the 1950s or something. No, actually, the height of modernism would be before World War I. It would be something that's arriving with like the New York Armory show right before World War I. It's the fin de siècle, it's the Belle Epoque era. And that what we have in the 20th century is late modernism and the beginnings of postmodernism, actually. I mentioned Heidegger. So Heidegger is foundational for postmodernism, because indeed postmodernism does come with the 20th century avant-garde with World War I and those kinds of things. But we won't get there until we get to Adorno at the end. So most of the reading is going to be the much earlier history, and it's going to be centered in a particular way around the middle of the 19th century, the middle of the 1800s, circa 1848, but in a way that we'll see is actually, it's a kind of an aporia in the course, to use another term that's kind of jargony, meaning we'll be talking around it. So I sent you guys the link to the syllabus, but also the preferred course books. And we're basically reading a bunch of authors, 3 of whom we're reading for more than 1 week. The rest of whom we're reading 1 week. So Kant, Nietzsche, and Adorno are going to be read for 3 or more weeks. The Critique of Judgment, which we'll start next week, we'll be doing that in 3 tranches of 100 pages each. So one little caveat that I'll give you guys is that it's a little bit of a steep learning curve in terms of reading. So it's a steep reading curve. Especially Kant's language, the prose is going to be perhaps difficult, not as difficult as some of his other philosophical writings, but perhaps somewhat difficult. And so I'll just ask you guys, ask your forbearance and patience and just hold on, and it will get easier. So by the 3rd week of Kant, you will know how to read him, and it won't be as difficult. So it's going to be sort of throwing the children in the deep end of the pool to teach them to swim, which actually when I was a swimming instructor, I did not do that to the children. I didn't terrify the children like that, but some of the other instructors did do that. But it's going to be a little bit of that. Then we're going to have 1 week of Schiller. So I mentioned in the email we've got everything in PDF on Canvas. But the books, you might want to buy the books that we're reading for more than a week. So Kant's Critique of Judgment, Schiller, the essays, and we're reading one very lengthy essay, again 100 pages, out of his essays, and then there are a couple of supplemental readings also collected there, so that book might be worth getting. All depends on how you guys feel like reading. Do you feel like reading PDFs on a screen or feel like reading a real book? The Wordsworth is entirely supplemental, so that is completely optional, because we're just going to use that for illustration with Schiller. Hegel's introductory lectures on aesthetics, again, another 100-page little book, probably worth getting. Nietzsche's basic writings. So we're reading 3 things by Nietzsche, all collected in the basic writings. So we're reading The Birth of Tragedy, On the Genealogy of Morals, and The Case of Wagner. I've got that on Canvas as a ebook, not as a PDF. Lukács's Theory of the Novel, another short book that we're just doing in 1 week. Paul Celan, who's going to be illustrative for some of Adorno's writings, both his essay on lyric poetry and society, and also for aesthetic theory. And then finally, Adorno's Aesthetic Theory, which is another book that you might want to purchase, just to have it. Although we're not reading all of it, we're reading most of it. That's the books, the course books that are marked as such, but like I said, everything at this point is available on Canvas. So none of these are, strictly speaking, required to be purchased. And one of the formal requirements of the course is do the reading. As difficult as it might be, really try to do the reading. We're going to discuss things in class, assuming everyone has done the reading. Right, so I'm not going to summarize. I'm going to talk about some major concepts, but I'm not really going to summarize the argument. So please do the reading. Please attend every class. So this is a Friday afternoon, evening class, and so it's on the weekend, and it's getting into more of the weekend because it's late Friday. And so try not to plan to miss any class sessions, because you'll miss a lot if you miss class. So it's another formal requirement. There's a formal requirement with respect to student presentations, which I'm going to talk about. And that is, I'm going to take volunteers of teams of 2 to post notes to discussion threads that I will set up on Canvas for each week's readings. And then everyone is invited, but not required, to post their notes to the discussion threads, but 2 people will volunteer to definitely post notes to the discussion threads and also to verbally summarize their notes in class to kick off our discussion. Right. And given the number of students, the number of weeks, the number of readings, probably everyone will present more than once. Right, so there will be presentations in teams of 2, and you'll do so more than once, twice over the course of the semester. And then finally, there's a final paper. And the paper is basically there are 3 segments of the course, and the choice with respect to the paper corresponds to the 3 sections of the course, and also to the 3 segments of readings. So it's a reading-based paper. It's not a research paper. So it's really about learning through writing, reading through writing. Sometimes you don't know what you've read until you try to write about it. Right? And sometimes you don't know what you think about something until you try to write about it, in fact. So it's a reading by writing and a learning by writing exercise, but again, not something that's meant to summarize, but rather be an essay, where you're assuming your reader has read what you've read, and then it's your thoughts on the reading. It's your drawing out the themes and the implications from the readings as you would want to discuss them. And that is also true for the notes. So the presentation notes, the discussion thread notes are really your responses to the readings, your thoughts about the readings, the things that you want to focus on, that you would like us to discuss, rather than feeling like you have to comprehensively summarize or present the readings. You don't. It's really your own thoughts on it. All right, so those are the formal requirements for the course. Is that pretty clear in terms of what's expected? Okay. All right, so before we get into the, so I mentioned that we're going to do Kant next week. So we'll be reading literally page 1 to to page 100 of the Kant, of the edition of the Critique of Judgment. That the PDF is on the canvas, but also listed for purchase. And that's going to be taking us from the introduction. He's got a preface and an introduction. Pay attention to those, because those will give you all of his ideas up front. And then we'll be reading the first part of his argument that will basically take us up to the beautiful. So there are three kind of core ideas to the Kant book. And the first is the beautiful. And the second is the sublime. And the third is the teleological. We'll maybe talk a little bit about that today, given the in-class readings that we have. Okay, so gotta get volunteers for next week. Speaking of which, I haven't had you guys introduce yet. You guys, okay. So tell me your name. Maddie, yes, and? June, right. So I know you guys from before, but just so that everyone knows. And on that, thank you. Let's go around and introduce everybody. So let me bring up my list of students. And then we'll just go down the alphabetical list and also have you guys say your preferred name, how you'd like to be referred to, because that's not always accurate. Usually this is more accurate than the other thing that I have, the PeopleSoft thing, but even this is not always accurate. So, is it Alexander?
He's in London.
Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, that's the other thing that I'll say logistically. So I'm recording the class, and I will post the audio recordings to a Google Drive folder for you guys to refer to in case you should miss class. Okay. Nicholas? Is Nicholas here? No? I wrote a letter of recommendation. Nicholas for our program. Okay. Matt? You said Matt is also missing? Wow, so this is like a massacre. You just like decimated straight out the bat. Is it Kayla? Hi.
I'm Kayla. I use she, her. I'm in painting and drawing. I took your marks class.
Over the summer, that's right. Yeah. Absolutely, yep.
Yeah, I really liked it. Yeah, that's all.
Painting and drawing.
Yeah, painting and drawing.
Great. Cool.
I'm Omer. I'm a grad student in painting and drawing.
Subin?
My name is Subin. I go by Shiver Journals, and I focus on water painting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also another veteran student of mine.
My name is Songwon, but most professors just end up calling me Song. I go by he, him pronoun. I'm a sophomore, and I major in painting and drawing.
You guys are going to be frustrated with me, you painting and drawing people, because I forgot to mention this. Our examples are going to be largely non-visual. We will be looking at some visual things, but actually our examples are going to be heavily literary and music. So, but anyway, sorry. Hopefully it won't be too frustrating.
I'm Maddie. Also,
Excellent. June?
I am June. I'm a junior here.
David?
I'm Jacob. I'm also a second year grad student in the painting and drawing department. I use he, him pronouns.
Brianna?
I'm Brianna. She, her. I'm a senior and I do ceramics and sculpture.
I actually did a crit in the ceramics department last semester. Seems like an insurgent department. Robbie? Is Robbie here? June? Is June here? Anna?
It just exists. Sorry.
Life is an artwork.
Yeah.
Joshi?
Actually, I'm a second year grad student in this computer computation department.
Cool. Elijah?
I'm Elijah, him, and I'm a junior in the painting department.
I'm Juliana. I'm a junior. I go by she, her, and I do sculpture and collage.
Great. Elton?
I'm Eldon. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a sophomore, also doing painting and drawing. First class of yours. My multi-level teacher last semester, I talked about what I was interested in. She did recommend you as professor, so I'm pretty excited.
Oh, very good. Cool. Nina? Charlie?
I'm Charlie. I'm a senior in sculpture.
Yeah, I'm Anna. I'm a second year grad art history student. I'm auditing here. Yeah, because that's it. I've been in multiple courses before, like this.
And Sharon?
I'm Sharon. I'm doing art history based on drawing style and
Great. Cool. My own background, by the way, is in visual art as well as in poetry. Those are my creative fields. And so we'll see. We're going to be talking about aesthetic experience in a way that applies to all forms of art, including literary art and dramatic or performative art, including music. And we'll see, because both Kant and Hegel are going to sort of set up little hierarchies of the different art forms in a way that will be unfamiliar to us. Won't really quite make sense to us because we're not in the 17 and 1800s, so we're not living in that moment exactly that they were, and in which cultural prominence of different forms were very different from our own kind of artistic culture and aesthetic culture more generally. All right, so okay, so you'll see that I've given a bunch of like readings that we're not going to discuss today as optional supplemental readings, but that might be of interest in terms of introducing some themes. We're going to focus on these three short readings that we're going to read together in class today and discuss, and just to sort of establish some concepts and some categories. And there are two sets of the optional supplemental readings. One is about modernism, and the other is about postmodernism. And again, it's just to situate, if you're interested. These are classic debates, we might say, Greenberg and Clark and Fried. That's one sort of classic debate. And then another classic debate is Habermas and Lyotard over like the meaning of modernism and then the meaning of postmodernism. So we'll see how some of these ideas might come up throughout the course. But we're going to focus today on a more kind of general and in some ways more fundamental definition of our object, And where these readings come from is around the time I started teaching here at SAIC. A few things were published. Two of the pieces that we're going to read in class today. The other one was a bit earlier and was actually published around the time that I myself was getting my MFA here at SAIC, back in the day, in 1996. This piece, however, the alumnus profile for the alumni magazine of the University of Chicago was published in 2003, and what was it, 2004? One of those years. And Hamza Walker used to teach here at SAIC for a number of years. All right, so let's see what we have to say coming from Hamza Walker. Okay, so Hamza Walker's worst nightmare, he says, is realizing that you are still in Cobb Hall, where you took all your undergraduate classes, and I live it every day. So I was a grad student at the University of Chicago. I didn't do that undergrad. I went there for my PhD. And in fact, I taught undergraduate courses at the University of Chicago, and I taught them in Cobb Hall, in fact. So Walker, whom the New York Times has labeled one of the 7 most influential curators in the country, it was 2005, excuse me, is Director of Education and Associate Curator for the Renaissance Society, the non-collecting museum of contemporary art on Cobb Hall's 4th floor. Nightmare? Walker's broad smile betrays his enthusiasm for his home turf. Founded in 1915 at the university, so during World War I, but before the U.S. actually jumped into World War I, the Independent Renaissance Society has helped introduce the city to the works of such artists as Pablo Picasso, Piet Mondrian, Ferdinand Léger, Bruce Nauman, and Cindy Sherman, and established itself as a champion of vanguard art, otherwise known as avant-garde art. Recent exhibitions have included latter-day stars Felix Gonzalez Torres, Helmut Jahn, Carol Walker, and Michael Auder. This summer, Walker stood in the middle of the Renaissance's 3,500 square foot, single-room exhibition space beneath Cobb's north roof, taking a look at the final cleanup from the latest show, Rebecca Morris's abstract paintings. He'd already envisioned the layout for 5 gigantic video screens needed for the next installation, a collaborative work by Berlin-based artist Peter Weltz and choreographer William Forsythe, tentatively titled All the Pretty Corpses, opening in November. Logistical matters, where to place the screens, how high to turn up the volume, when to dim the lights, account for a significant part of his work, Walker explains. I have a very non-romantic view of whatever curatorial labor has become. In working with artists, it is not simply about the level of content, it also involves discussions about the technical requirements for a given piece. Born in New York City, the son of a jazz musician and a mother who worked several odd jobs, Walker later moved with his family to Baltimore, where he grew up as, quote, a young punk full of rage. What could be more alienating than that? He asks. The time, the 70s. The place? So if you guys know your Baltimore, do you know your John Waters films? Have you heard of John Waters? John Waters films? No? You need to watch some John Waters films, then you get a real sense of Baltimore in the 70s and 80s. It's going to be pretty dark. Today his favorite artists work to alienate the viewer. Alienation, he says, turns me on. Now wait, he's used the word alienation like 3 times. Boom. So let's pay attention to that one. People who tell him they just love contemporary art make him suspicious. I distrust them immediately, he says. I don't inherently like art, he says. That's not a given for me. At Chicago, majoring in art history, he visited the Renaissance regularly. But all the while I held contemporary work in disdain, he says. So clearly there was some Freudian dynamic at work. What does that mean? Freudian ambivalence, love-hate relationship. Coming to terms with his contempt informed Walker's appreciation of contemporary art. Quote, "The work is not the source of my disdain, or my dissatisfaction, or my frustration. The work can only prompt it." He actually welcomes contemporary art's illegibility and hermeticism, and the frustration it can cause a viewer. Quote, "I do have a passion for it," meaning makes you suffer. But it's driven in equal parts by love and disdain. He never imagined becoming a curator. "I fell into this," he says. He didn't anticipate making a career of his studies, but he discovered that, quote, "after college, any kind of sustained intellectual nourishment about contemporary work is very hard to find unless you are with other artists." And that is true. So he focused on becoming a member of the artistic community, working as a public art coordinator at Chicago's Department for Cultural Affairs, that's just up the street here, and volunteering at the former Randolph Street Gallery before he joined the Renaissance Society in 1994. Today, Walker, a tireless traveler and networker, has become known beyond Chicago's art scene not only for his innovative curatorial work, but also for his wide-ranging thinking and writing about contemporary art, published in industry magazines and exhibition catalogs. The New York Times called him one of the museum world's most talented essayists and lauded his storytelling approach to shows. Walker is skeptical of the flattery, stressing that he can't stand narrative art. I agree with him on that. He wants his shows to function critically, he says, commenting on how we live now. Okay, so art is alienating. Art frustrates. Source of ambivalence, but not really the source of ambivalence, sort of prompting it. Maybe there's some other source for it. And art should function critically on the way we live now. This year he received the Manil Collection Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement, given to a curator in early to mid-career. But while he denies being the art world's dramatic figure and rising star, as local and national newspapers have described him over the past few years, he admits that now he can't imagine doing anything else. If you take a domesticated animal out in the wild, it cannot survive. That's what I feel like. This other world, where people have 9-to-5 jobs, that's the wild. Right? So there's something subtle there too. Art's distance from life. Art's distance from life. Both art's distance from life, but also art institutions' distance from life. All right, so now we're going to go back a little bit in time to, where is our Susan Buck-Morss? Okay. To an article by Susan Buck-Morss. This was published in the Art Journal October, which is an important postmodernist art journal that got started in the 70s, was very influential in the 80s and 90s, and actually was a place where a lot of Frankfurt School critical theory, art criticism was translated and published for the first time in English. And Susan Buck-Morss is an important sort of first generation Frankfurt School scholar who kind of helped bring Frankfurt School critical theory into academic life. So she's well known for a couple of books, The Origin of Negative Dialectics on Benjamin and Adorno, The Dialectics of Seeing about Benjamin's Arcades project, and then she's written some other books. She wrote a book on Hegel and Haiti, about Hegel and the French and Haitian revolutions, and also Dream World and Catastrophe, which is about Soviet art and the fall of the Soviet Union. All right, so here's Susan Buck-Morss. These are all people I'm personally acquainted with, by the way, so I have a bias. So they did a visual culture questionnaire in the October Art Journal, in which they asked about a new discipline, interdisciplinary discipline, visual cultural studies. We have VCS now here. And a bunch of people responded, and hers was, to my mind, the more interesting of the responses, and captured some key ideas that I think are pedagogically useful. Let's see what she has to say. The production of a discourse of visual culture entails the liquidation of art as we have known it. All right, so notice culture and art are being opposed, or being set up antagonistically. So discourse of visual culture liquidates art. There is no way within such a discourse for art to sustain a separate existence. Not as a practice, not as a phenomenon, not as an experience, not as a discipline. Museums would then need to become double encasings, preserving art objects and preserving the art idea. Art history departments would be moved in with archaeology, and one of artists. In the recently expired socialist societies, so this is several years after the fall of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and communist regimes, artists printed up calling cards with their profession listed confidently after their name and phone number. Chris Cutrone, artist, call me. Or maybe an email address, or a Substack URL. In recently restructured capitalist societies, so in the era of neoliberalism, artists became caught in a dialectical cul-de-sac, a contradictory dead end, attempting to rescue the autonomy of art as a reflexive, critical practice by attacking the museum, the very institution that sustains the illusion that art exists. Artists, as a social class, demand sponsors, the state, private patrons, corporations. Their products enter the market through a dealer-critic system that manipulates value and is mediated by galleries, museums, and private collections. Tomorrow's artists may opt to go underground, much like Freemasons of the 18th century. They may choose to do their work esoterically while employed as producers of visual culture. So here's a question. Are you guys artists, or are you guys cultural producers? What is your practice? Do people do that? What's your practice? And then at the Art Institute, for a number of years, I don't know if this is true anymore, research. How is your work doing research? Have you heard that kind of language? No? Yes? Oh, right? So anything but art. By the way, when I was getting my MFA here, I was in a very left-wing department, and actually I'm a crazy leftist out there in the world too. But anyway, and I came to the department because I was a leftist and I wanted to be around other leftists, but they immediately attacked me for making art. And I was like, I am getting a Master of Fine Arts, and I am at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, motherfuckers. What? Art? Wait, what? Too arty. Chris, your work's too arty. Okay? Right? Because they had an activist conception of art that I think persists. So in which case, the value of art, why one would become an artist to begin with, is driven underground. It becomes something esoteric. It becomes something that we can't even talk about. Instead, what do you talk about? You talk about your social identity. You talk about your biography. You talk about anything except why you're doing art and what art is for you at all. Culture. That's culture. We talk about culture. We talk about art. Here's a thesis statement for the entire course. Artists' work, artist's work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. And then she says, our work as critics is to recognize it. So notice the artist and the critic are in a kind of reciprocal relationship. So we're going to be thinking about that. What it means to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. Can this be done best, or done at all, within a new interdisciplinary field of visual studies? What would be the episteme, or theoretical frame of such a field? Twice at Cornell, that's where she's taught for a long time, Cornell University. Over the past decade, we've had meetings to discuss the creation of a visual studies program. Both times it was painfully clear that institutionalization cannot by itself produce such a frame, and the discussions among a disparate group of art historians, anthropologists, computer designers, social historians, and scholars of cinema, literature, and architecture still did not coalesce into a program. Still, visual culture has become a presence on campus. It has worked its way into many of the traditional disciplines and lives there in suspended isolation, encapsulated within theoretical bubbles. The psychoanalytic bubble I mentioned Freud earlier is the biggest. Really not Freud, it's more Lacan. It's Lacan. But there are others. One could list a common set of readings, a canon of texts by Barthes, Benjamin, Foucault, Lacan, as well as a pre-canon of text by a long list of contemporary writers. Certain themes are standard: the reproduction of the image, the society of the spectacle, envisioning the other, scopic regimes, the male gaze, the machine eye. Today, the phrase visual studies calls up 202 entries in a keyword search at the Cornell University libraries. That's because they had like little CD-ROMs. They weren't on the internet quite yet. The internet existed, but we'll get there. She mentions it. There is a media library, a cinema program, an art museum, a theater art center, 2 slide libraries, what are slides, and a half dozen possessively guarded, department-owned video cassette players. What the hell are those? If the theoretical bubbles burst, there remains the infrastructure of technological reproduction. Again, Benjamin's essay, The Work of Art in Each Mechanical Reproduction. Visual culture, once a foreigner to the academy, has gotten its green card and is here to stay. Oh, that's a kind of interesting metaphor, isn't it? Silent movies at the beginning of the century, the 20th century, not the 21st, initiated the utopian idea of a universal language of images, one that could glide over political and ethnic borders and set to right the Tower of Babel. Action films and MTV, what the hell is MTV? At the end of the century have realized this idea in secularized, instrumentalized form, producing subjects for the next stage of global capitalism. So here's an idea. The utopian potential of art becomes something that just produces subjects for the next stage of global capitalism. In this way, visual culture becomes the concern of the social sciences. Images in the mind motivate the will, wrote Walter Benjamin, alluding to the political power of images claimed by surrealism. But his words could provide the motto as well for the advertising industry, product sponsoring, and political campaigning. Whereas today, the freedom of expression of artists is defended on formal grounds that stress the virtuality of the representation. The images of art, it is argued, have no effect in the realm of deeds. So she's writing around the time of, there was a big kind of government censorship controversy in the 90s, where they actually pointed to controversial art and used it to cut funding for art, NEA, and especially regional re-granting programs. And so a lot of like local art institutions went under because they got their government money cut. Okay. A critical analysis of these, so what the defense was, oh, well, the art has no social effect, and so the government should leave it alone. That was the argument in defense. But she's saying, rather, a critical analysis of the image as a social object is needed more urgently than a program that legitimates its culture. Again, the difference between art and culture. We need to be able to read images emblematically and symptomatically, and we'll be talking about that in the course, in terms of the most fundamental questions of social life. This means that critical theories are needed. theories that are themselves visual, that show rather than argue. Such conceptual constellations convince by their power to illuminate the world, bringing to consciousness what was before only dimly perceived, so that it becomes available for critical reflection. Okay, so this is a way of elaborating for her what she said earlier about the role of critics, is to recognize the critical moment of aesthetic experience that artists sustain through their work. So how to do that? Well, both the art and the criticism help to bring to consciousness what was before only dimly perceived, so that it becomes available for critical reflection. And then she says, I do not understand the description of anthropological models and socio-historical models as antithetical poles of this theoretical project. Any interpretation worth its salt demands both. It needs to provide a socio-historical and biographical story of origins that estranges the object from us. That's important. So giving a social or biographical account of art should actually put it at a distance from us. And shows us that its truth is not immediately accessible. And she calls that the object's prehistory. And, secondly, a story of deferred action, its after history, that comes to terms with the potency of the object within our own horizon of concerns. So why do we still go back to these historical artworks? How do they still speak to us, even across a historical divide? This will date the article a bit, but maybe not that much, because we have to think about how we've naturalized some things. While the internet is the topic and the medium for new courses in digital culture, it is striking to anyone who has visited the internet how visually impoverished a homepage can be. Cyber digits reproduce the moving image haltingly and the static image unimpressively. The possibility of computer screens replacing television screens may mean a great deal to stockholders of telephone companies or cable companies, but it will not shake the world of the visual image. Aesthetic experience, sensory experience, is not reducible to information. Is it old-fashioned to say so? Perhaps the era of images that are more than information is already behind us. Perhaps discussions about visual culture as a field have come too late. It is with nostalgia that we boycott the video store, what the hell is that, and insist upon seeing movies on the big screen. The producers of the visual culture of tomorrow are the camera women, video film editors, city planners, set designers for rock stars, tourism packagers, marketing consultants, political consultants, television producers, commodity designers, layout persons, and cosmetic surgeons. They are the students who sit in our classes today. What will be gained and by whom in offering them a program in visual studies? Meaning, are we just training cultural producers? Are we training people to be technicians of the next subjects of global capitalism? Or are we educating artists, which would be very different, potentially. So she doesn't teach at an art school. We're at an art school. But some things are still the same, right? Especially in terms of how much difficulty we have in justifying art at all, like justifying art per se. And finally, this is going to be a more difficult piece for us to read. A little bit longer and a little bit more dense, but let's take a breath and do it. So this is Robert Pippin. This is another questionnaire posed by another journal. The journal here is Critical Inquiry. That's a journal published at the University of Chicago, and Robert Pippin teaches at the University of Chicago. And Pippin is a scholar of Kant and Hegel, who's also influenced by the Frankfurt School. So he was an acolyte. He had Herbert Marcuse as a mentor at University of California, San Diego, and we might come back around to Herbert Marcuse later in the semester. But he was a more famous member of the Frankfurt School who became a kind of political cause celeb in the late 1960s and early 1970s. All right, so here's Robert Pippin. So he's responding to a questionnaire sent to various scholars and also editorial board members of the journal, asking about the current state and potential future of critical theory. Here's his response. So other board members, by which he means editorial board members of the journal, I expect, he says, will comment on the state of matters critical in literature and the arts. There is also, of course, the issue of the status of a critical theory of society. So he says, I wanted to say something about the state and future of critical theory on sich as such, essentially the left Hegelian Marxist Frankfurt School tradition. Although the notion has become broad enough so that even the likes of Heidegger and his influential legacy and army of Epigones are relevant. Okay, so what the hell is that? So Heidegger, of course, was a very virulent anti-Marxist. That's why he joined the Nazi Party to stamp out Marxism, communism, etc. And then he influenced the people that I like to affectionately call the French fries. Namely Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, also Lacan, and even some Marxists like Althusser and some other people, going all the way up to, do you guys know who Zizek is? You heard of Slavoj Zizek? Okay. Zizek and other people, Badiou. So anyway, the influential army of Epigones are relevant to critical theory, even though they are in many ways the opposite of the left Hegelian Marxist Frankfurt School tradition. He says there are obvious implications for contemporary literary theory, but I won't try to get into that. This will just be an attempt to identify the still unresolved problem. So he thinks that there's one problem, the problem. It will have to be breathless, and I'm not entirely sure it is relevant, but here goes. So one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is to pluralize everything, right? To say that there isn't one problem. There are many problems. There's no Marxism, there are only Marxisms. There's no feminism, there are just feminisms. Pluralize everything. No, he's insisting there's one problem. Now where does that come from? We'll see. Capitalism. Capitalism unites all the people of the world in one problem. But we'll get there. The historical dimension first. He says, I understand critical theory, or perhaps even literary criticism once it began to think of itself as informed by philosophical theory of some sort, to be at its core a post-Kantian phenomenon. That is, very much a legacy of the original Kantian idea of critical philosophy, which is what we're going to start getting into next week. A critique by reason of itself. The basic claim is that first philosophy, or prima philosophia, what it was called, the foundation of all pre-modern university learning and all science, was not in fact any longer regarded as first. So a kind of non-foundationalism. Rather, a critical account of the possibility of such, the possibility of any first philosophy, or any other claim to know, was first necessary. This is all immediately subject to Hegel's famous objection that it is like trying to learn to swim before one enters the water, but that's one side. What then does it mean to see Kant, or the Kantian moment, as the hinge on which something quite new in the history of philosophy and social and perhaps aesthetic theory swings open? All right, so this is what we're going to start getting into next week, the critical turn in philosophy, and its historical moment and how it's bound up with other cultural, political, economic phenomena. The most important result of the all-destroying Kant, that's what he was known by his critics, was the destruction of metaphysics as traditionally understood. and that is a priori knowledge of substance. So knowledge of substance before you have an experience of anything. Philosophy, which he defines now, Pippin, as non-empirical claims to know. So what can we know just on the basis of our own cognitive processes without any first-hand concrete experience? Any non-empirical claims to know could not be understood as about the world or things in themselves, but rather had to be reconceived as concerned with our mode of knowledge of objects. Eventually, this would become the linguistic turn, logicism, sociology of knowledge, all sorts of things. But the most important result for later critical theory concerned the status of necessity in philosophy. So why is philosophy necessary? Or Kant's attempt to argue that some philosophical account of the once and for all necessary conditions of knowledge was possible. To make a very long story very short, after Kant, while the critical attack on the very possibility of first philosophy survived, this faith in a formal philosophy capable of delivering an epistemological form of necessary truth did not. Or maybe it did, we'll see. Retaining the notion of a subjective contribution to, legislation of, establishing laws for, the possibility of representational content, or all aspects of human experience fraught with oughts, and I'll explain what the ought means in a second, but without the necessity or fixity, meant that it wasn't long before the most important aspect of the Kantian aftermath was apparent. Hegel's famous claim in the preface to the Philosophy of Right that philosophy is its own time comprehended in thought, or that every philosopher is essentially a child of his time. This all meant that some new way of conceiving of philosophy adequate to the realization of the radically historical nature of the human condition was now necessary, especially one that could distinguish in some way what was central, elemental, essential, in some way that on which other quite variable and much more contingent aspects of human historical time depended. The problem of understanding properly, especially critically, conceptual, artistic, and social change was henceforth at the forefront of much European philosophy. So critical philosophy means philosophy that's concerned with change. And think of the time. Right, so when is Kant writing? At the end of the 1700s. What's going on at that time? Major social and political changes. What had happened in the few hundred years before Kant was writing? Huge upheavals. There was the Renaissance, there was the Protestant Reformation, which is a kind of a nice theological way of describing what was actually a war in Europe that killed millions of people over the course of 100 years. That's what the Protestant Reformation was. And then the revolutions. There was the Dutch Revolt, there was the English Civil War, the English Glorious Revolution, and then the American Revolution, and then finally the French Revolution, which will make an appearance in our readings, in the Schiller, when we read Schiller, and also in Hegel. So change. He says, this is all pretty much a comic book summary, and it leaves a lot of gaps, but it gets me to the point I wanted to make. For it was also the time as this consensus was building about historicity, post-metaphysical philosophy, and so forth. So philosophy, post-metaphysical means not traditional metaphysics, which is what philosophy had been for thousands of years, and so forth, that some consensus was also building in European high culture that the modern form of life coming into view after the middle of the 19th century, so middle of the 1800s, or so, was in some basic way unacceptable, unaffirmable, pathological even, certainly ugly. So what is coming into view in the middle of the 1800s? Capitalism. So this is the end of the Industrial Revolution, 1750 to 1850. So that's the moment. To cut to the chase, it then became obvious how difficult it would be to theorize, as it is now put, this gap or absence or lack in this new comprehensive form of life. And the idea of an underlying historical teleology, such as what was missing was what was not yet actual, but in the process of being realized, began to seem a metaphysical regression. This meant that the problem of critical theory turned out to be connected to a very old problem, indeed the oldest, long ago called the problem of non-being. How to say what is not without saying nothing. In this case, it is the problem of theorizing what was historically missing, absent, or simply not in this historical moment, and understanding the nature of its claim on our attention, or how to understand, theorize the recoil or aversion to modernity already apparent in Holderlin's Nostalgia and other romantic productions, which we will actually address in the course, and much more in evidence in Kierkegaard's The Present Age, Nietzsche's Death of God, and so forth. Formulating an adequate account of what was missing, unrealized, or just unacceptable in these altered conditions proved difficult and provoked ever more radical solutions. Then he says, I think this problem remains poorly understood and hardly yet well worked out. Not resolved by Benjamin, his messianism and idiosyncratic philosophy of history, nor in Adorno's negative dialectics and attempted recovery of the non-identical, although Adorno comes as close as anyone to realizing the generality and difficulty of the post-idealist dimensions of the problem, and not in the most radical response to the problem, Heidegger's. What is sought is some sense of the falseness, not merely of contemporary philosophical positions, but also of everyday life itself. So again, we're in the realm of how to think critically about the way we live now. The falseness, deceptiveness, thoughtlessness, and forgetfulness of the ordinary itself. And all this without a reinstallation of traditional reality appearance distinctions. Heidegger came up with a novel, explosive account of the inherent nothingness of the everyday world, its potential for an episodic, largely inexplicable breakdown in anxiety and homelessness, and then proposed a vast novel ontological account as a way of thinking through the implications of this distinct fragility and groundlessness. So much for a short history of non-being. He says, I only mean that I think critical theory still needs an account of what isn't in what is, and still needs to understand the dimensions of this problem as an interconnected problem from Kant on appearance, Hegel on dialectic and teleology, Marx on contradiction, Kierkegaard on despair, Nietzsche on the nihil and nihilism, Adorno on negative dialectics, and Heidegger on nichts, or nothingness. So we'll be addressing Kant on appearance. We'll graze the ideas of dialectic and teleology in Hegel. We won't be dealing with Marx on contradiction other than indirectly. And we won't be dealing with Kierkegaard, but we will be dealing with Nietzsche on the nihil and nihilism. And of course, we'll be getting into Adorno. And we're not doing Heidegger. He says, in fact, I would say at the level of discussion and awareness of this issue, in its historical dimensions, with respect both to the history of critical theory and the history of modernization, has regressed. So our awareness has regressed. And then he goes through people who he thinks have not done a good job with it. And he says, so it is now possible to say that the problem with contemporary critical theory is that it has become insufficiently critical. And he says, I should say that I still believe that the Hegelian response to this situation, post-metaphysical philosophy, radical historicity, modernist dissatisfactions, that's an important coupling. The idea that modernism might be based on dissatisfaction, discontent, is the most promising. It is tagged by such phrases as the causality of fate, internal critique, we'll be dealing with this as immanent critique, internal critique, and determinate negation, and usually involves a three-stage claim. The lack or gap or failure in question is initially the obvious one. A community is not living up to its own ideals, or cannot, as in tragic situations. This is then said to have unavoidable experiential consequences, a kind of suffering due to its own unreason, and this feature of course, is why attention to contemporary literature and art can become so theoretically important as a way of evincing and beginning to diagnose such suffering. So remember what Buck-Morss said, symptomatic, emblematic and symptomatic. And then the most difficult claim, that the status of the ideal not being lived up to is something like the best we've been able to do so far. And so it is not just a fact about a local community at such a stage that it cannot live up to its own ideal. Rather, that failure has significance beyond its local meaning, all of which forces on stage the difficult issue of the referent of the community so described, and the now tired issue of grand narratives. So postmodernism tried to overthrow the grand narratives of history. Pippin is making a plea for a return to the grand narrative of history, namely a universal significance to a community not being able to live up to its own ideals. And we'll be getting into this, but a basic point would be, I mentioned the American and French revolutions, the ideals, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, liberté, égalité, fraternité, these values. How well are we doing living up to those values? Not very well. Right? And so what's the significance of that? Does that mean that the ideals, the values are bullshit? No, it does not. That's the idea anyway. Okay. It means these ideals are the best that we've been able to do so far, and they represent what isn't in what is. What is missing in the way things are. Regardless of how all this might be worked out, there is also a historical cost for the neglect or under-attention or lack of resolution of this core critical problem, and that cost is repetition. Repetition. Essentially, the cost is the rather mysterious repetition, now over several generations, of a number of the original moments of recoil, revulsion, and alienation, there's that word again, among the founding formulations in modernism. How long can art be about the end of art? Why did modernist art turn to itself as its subject? How many iterations of what is essentially 19th century French bourgeois self-hatred are possible in the novel before we exhaust that moment? Well, not yet. It may seem extreme to claim at all that such repetition exists, that postmodernism, say, was an instance of such repetition, and also to claim that it is tied somehow to the dim understanding we have of the post-Kantian situation with respect to, let's say, the necessary conditions for the possibility of what isn't. But however sketchy, that is what I wanted to suggest. I'm not sure it will get us anywhere. Philosophy rarely does. Perhaps philosophy exists to remind us that we haven't gotten anywhere. Okay. So, what is this language about? I promised that I was going to discuss the is and the ought, and I will. But I want to first turn to a short poem, an example of a modernist poem, but written in a kind of German romantic style. And this is by Rilke. This is the Archaic torso of Apollo. And have you guys ever seen these kind of statues at the museum? The torsos, the ancient torsos. So they're missing their heads, their arms, their legs. Right, everything's been knocked off. And then usually the genitals were knocked off too. If they hadn't fallen off by themselves, then the Christians had done their iconoclasm and their vandalism against the pagan art. All right, so Rilke is a turn of the 20th century. He's an early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century poet. And he's a modernist, but he's using romantic tropes, romantic kind of images. And Romanticism was all about classical antiquity, the Middle Ages, basically the pre-bourgeois world, the pre-modern world, and a kind of a longing for it. But this is not a romantic kind of nostalgia piece. This is more a modernist piece. And we'll see how and why that might be the case. So the archaic torso of Apollo. So what is Apollo? We're going to get into this later when we read Nietzsche on the birth of tragedy. So Apollo is the sun god, And as the sun god, he's the god of form. So the idea is that Apollo, the sun, Apollo is riding in his chariot across the sky, and he's casting out rays of light. And in casting out the rays of light, he is giving form to the world. God of form. So what does it mean that we have the God of form represented by a fragmented or fractured form, by a damaged form, the archaic torso? We cannot know his legendary head, with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp, in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs, to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here, there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. Okay, so that's the twist at the end that makes it a modernist poem, change. Right? So what are we doing when we're looking at the broken statue? We're reconstructing it with our imagination. Right? We're giving it more than is actually empirically, physically there. And we're transforming it in our mind as an object. And what is that activity of the imagination telling us? That we must change our lives. So the third critique, Kant's critique of judgment, that we're going to start reading next week, it's about the faculty of the imagination. So he has three critiques, his critical philosophy. There are three critiques. The critique of pure reason, which is about the faculty of understanding. It's a faculty of concepts and theories. Practical reason, or the faculty of reason, which is about desire, morality, and practice. What is the good that we desire, and how do we get it in practice? That's the second critique. And then the third critique, the critique of judgment, is the critique of our aesthetic faculties, namely, first and foremost, the faculty of imagination. So that we can imagine things, we can think about things, we can hold things in our mind in a way that isn't about our conceptual or theoretical understanding, nor about our practical reason, but is more how we imagine the world, and that's connected to how we feel about the world, because aesthetics is about how we feel. Right? So feeling as a subjective faculty, as a rational, cognitive faculty, the imagination. And of course that's why he will talk about art. But mostly he's going to be talking about the experience of nature. And art, in his view, very 1700s understanding, art is the imitation of nature, meaning that art is a kind of representation of our experience of nature. But in both cases, it's through our imagination. All right, so I mentioned that I was going to explain the front with oughts. So let's look at that. And then we will end class today. We'll come back to this next week, but I want to introduce this just a little bit. We'll see that Kant, in the introduction to the third critique, to the critique of judgment, he says that there are two kinds of concepts of nature and concepts of freedom. Okay, so what's meant by nature? So Robert Pippin introduced the language of what is and what isn't, or what is and what ought to be, but is not. All right. So freedom. It's really going to be the main subject of the course, actually. Change, but change understood in a particular way. Not random change, not accidental change, not entropic change, but change that we are subjects of, that we are agents of, that we can take responsibility for, and that we can be conscious of. So not change that happens to us, where we're the object of change, but change in which we're the active agent and the subjects of that change, and can recognize our participation in change. But change in a particular way. So change understood as transformation. And actually transformation is a difficult thing to think about, because it involves two contradictory things. It involves continuity and it involves change, meaning change doesn't come out of nowhere, change comes out of what exists. And in a change, there's also a continuity. And so what we're really talking about is not something coming out of nowhere, but the transformation of what exists. So what is and what ought to be, understanding transformation as a process in which what could be and what should be is brought about. So how a potential and a possibility is realized. And we'll see that we'll talk about this next week. This is what's meant by critique. So we have Kant's three critiques, we have critical philosophy, we're going to be reading the critique of judgment, we're going to be reading the final of the three. And so it's going to be the synthesis of his other works. So we're going to be jumping to the end of the story. Critique means exploring conditions of possibility for our faculties. What makes our understanding possible? What makes our practical reason possible? What makes our aesthetic imagination possible? And how are these all faculties of freedom? So there are subjective faculties for changing the world, in which we also are changed. So one way of thinking about it is how a state of being is transformed in a process of becoming. So again, the ought is a possibility and a potential in what is, but not what exists yet. So another peculiar word that they use in this philosophy, Kant, Schiller, and Hegel, and then we'll see the others after them. Distinction between the extent, what exists, and its actuality. So the idea is that the actuality of something is not merely as it exists, but in its unfulfilled potential for further change. So the actuality of something is its ought rather than as it is. Go ahead.
I'm just curious about when you talk about transformation and change, is there a passive connotation to that, or is it more of a self-motivated?
It's an active and self-motivated. Yeah.
Affirmative.
Yes. Yes, that's right. And it's one of the reasons why this being and becoming is kind of a curious thing, because becoming suggests, and we'll get into this when we get into teleology, it suggests that there's a predetermined outcome, and that's not really the point. So it's a more open-ended process, and also it's not like moving to a kind of another state of being, not simply a cycle, but is, to use Nietzsche's language that we're going to encounter later in the semester, self-overcoming. So it's the self-overcoming of what is. So it's from within itself.
Does group courage directly affect each other? I mean, if an item, if the fact that it's being has action, does that mean are we possible or is that
Right, so the could and the should, the ought, it's funny, because could, it's a possibility, should has a more kind of moral, kind of imperative character to it. So indeed, Kant and other thinkers like him in his time thought that our highest duty, our highest obligation is to realize our potential. Now that becomes very problematic for us in the capitalist era. right? In other words, just because a change could happen, does that mean that it should happen? But again, they're innocent of that problem, actually. They're not innocent of history. A lot of very atrocious, violent, destructive history had taken place that they're aware of. But they're interested in how it contributes to freedom, how it changes things in a positive way despite the cost. Despite the cost. So it leaves us in a better position than we were before, despite the cost. And we'll talk about that later. But yeah, so the should is tricky. Again, the idea that our highest moral obligation is the exercise of our freedom. It's a tricky idea. It's anti-traditional, very anti-traditional. All right, so I mentioned concepts of freedom and concepts of nature. Nature is a peculiar concept here. So in English, nature connotates, and that's one of the reasons why I put nature in capital N. So we know it's like this metaphysical, philosophical object. Nature connotates in English to mean like physical and biological nature. But actually what's meant here is something else. It's also cultural and historical nature. So it's not simply what exists physically, biologically, but everything that has come into existence culturally through history. So everything that humans have changed then becomes part of what is. Right, so nature, and then to use language that we're going to encounter less in Kant and Schiller and more in Hegel, and spirit, or Geist. So all of these, by the way, we'll see with Kant. Kant is dialectical. Sometimes he's misrepresented as antinomical. He's actually dialectical, and he'll say so. The dialectic of being and becoming, the dialectic of nature and spirit, the dialectic of what is and what ought to be. So spirit is the self-transformation of nature, the self-overcoming of nature. It's also what makes possible our consciousness. So spirit, this word in German is Geist. Geist can be translated as spirit. It can also be translated as mind. So there's something about the movement of spirit, the process of transformation, that is the basis for us being conscious, for our consciousness. So the idea is that actually we're only conscious. This is a Rousseauian idea. We'll see in Kant and Schiller and Hegel. It's Rousseau's idea that we're conscious in the way that the other animals are not. So the animals do have consciousness, but we're conscious in a way that they're not. For instance, they never ask themselves, are we conscious? Only we ask ourselves, are we conscious? So animals might think, but they don't do philosophy. They feel, but they don't make art. Okay, so consciousness is made possible by this freedom that we have, in which we can reflect on the change that we do, that we make happen. And so there are geistic activities, activities that allow us to recognize our freedom. Art is one of them, for Hegel. So is politics, even though we would have a hard time saying that that's the case today. I was just shooting a documentary film at the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention. I know Mayor was there, filmmaker extraordinaire. Anyway, we'll see. I have to look at the footage. But anyway, and the last thing that you'd imagine is that this is where people are coming to consciousness and the progress of Geist in history. But yet it is. We're tasked to making it that, to recognizing what's going on, the change that's coming about. All right, and nature, therefore, is everything that exists, everything that's come into existence, everything that's given to us, everything that's natural in the sense of the world that we're born into, which is a historical and social and cultural world, not just a physical and biological world. Everything that we're born into, everything that's natural to us, but also what remains the same in continuity, in the process of transformation, the dialectic of that with the new and the different. So the question is, how how are the new and the different emerging out of the given and the same through our own activity that we can recognize, be conscious of, take responsibility for, that we are active agents of and subjects of, rather than objects of. Okay, so if an asteroid hits the Earth and smashes our planet, we will be the object of something that has happened. Although we will, maybe as it descends on us, we might say to the politicians, didn't you know the asteroid was coming? How come you didn't do anything about it? There have been movies made about this, yes? Right? Who's responsible for this? So we don't even accept something that we don't have hardly any control over as just the end of the story. Right? Now, given the fact that this is a dialectical process, what it means is that it has a paradoxical or contradictory character. And that's where the Nietzsche self-overcoming, Selbstaufhebung, comes into play. And it's not just Nietzsche, it's also Hegel. So, self-sublation, self-aufhebung. Aufhebung is an ordinary word in German, but it's got a weird philosophical meaning, as well as the ordinary meaning. The ordinary meaning is to take up. Aufhebung means to take up. So to take oneself up. Right? So the taking oneself up, the taking up of nature, nature taking itself up, and the movement of that is the movement of Geist or spirit, or of mind, of consciousness. Why is it paradoxical and contradictory? Because it means two things at the same time. So this transformation, being and becoming, continuity and change, it means that something is being fulfilled, something that existed before is being fulfilled, but it also means that what existed is being negated. It means that something that existed before that had an unrealized potential is being completed. So the potential is being realized, but also in realizing that potential, it's being transcended. And again, in realizing itself, it's actually abolishing itself. So let me just, and I know this is super abstract, but let's think about how art has changed in the last 200 years, for example. Art has changed through a process of apparently, if you look at the history, where a pre-existing practice or form or tendency fulfilled itself but also negated itself, completed itself but also transcended itself, realized itself but also abolished itself. It had a very negative character to it. Right? Can you separate the movement of art from anti-art movements that have actually existed going back to the 1800s? Right? So art has kept itself going, preserved itself, to use a Hegelian expression, by negating itself in the last 200 years. So that's remarkable. Now, the other point, and the Marxist point, Marx is going to be in the background. We'll get to some Marx along the way when we get to Adorno. The Marxist approach to capitalism, and this is really the rub of the whole thing, is that capitalism needs to be overcome, but it's a self-overcoming. Meaning how Marx understood socialism and communism, he understood it as both the fulfillment of capitalism as well as its negation. The completion of capitalism as well as its transcendence. The realization of capitalism as well as its abolition. The dialectical approach to capitalism, which is very different from capitalism is horrible, it's vicious, it's greedy, it's selfish individuals, it's destructive, atomizing, chews up the environment. Like anti-capitalism? No. The Marxist approach was capitalism is a state of being that ought to be something else, and that contains a potential within itself for a transformation. Right? So it's, as Lenin put it, children, I'm a crazy leftist, overcoming capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself. Overcoming capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself. Realizing its potential which would also be itself abolition. Dialectics. Ding, 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 ding. But we'll be talking about it for weeks. So we'll put some meat on the bones. We will explain, we will explore, and we'll be going back to the beginning of the story. All right, so I'll set up discussion thread for next week for you guys, Maddie and Jean, and then for others if you would like. Like I said, the preface and the introduction to Kant, they're going to be readable. It's actually more discursive than some of Kant's other writings. So Kant has some great essays that are very discursive. Actually, the third critique is more discursive than like the Critique of Pure Reason. However, it's still a philosophical treatise, meaning it's this gnarly, kind of logical, kind of condensed, very efficient kind of thing. So my recommendation on how to read Kant, which actually expands to how to read other things that are difficult to read, but reading Kant. One of my students early on, when I first started teaching this, said that she could only read Kant in a hypnagogic state. Do you know what a hypnagogic state is? It's like a state of like quasi-awareness or something, right? A hypnagogic state. Yes, exactly, exactly. You're like lying in bed reading, and then you're like falling asleep, and then in that state, it finally makes sense, which is like a little bit crazy. But anyway, the way I like to describe it is, and I don't know if children have this experience anymore, have you ever crossed a stream where you have to cross like by jumping from one rock to another, right? Okay, so the key there, you can't go too slow and you can't go too fast. You have to just skip across the rocks, just boom, boom, boom. So when reading Kant, don't go too fast and don't go too slow. Because if you go too fast or you go too slow, you'll fall between the rocks, you'll land in the water. And also, he is repetitive. If there are some motifs, he'll come back around, he riffs on things. And so, go with the flow. Go with the flow, that's how it will make sense. And so, like, the first 100 pages, it'll get more concrete when he gets into the beautiful. The first section of the book is rather abstract, but it's actually important in terms of him explaining why he's writing the book at all, and that's important to pay attention to. So that's the preface and the introduction. And then he'll get into the meat of the discussion. The first week, like I said, of Kant will be about the beautiful. The second week will be about the sublime, and the third week will be about the teleological. And we'll look at that in an overarching way at the beginning of class next week when we situate the whole thing within Kant's system of philosophy. All right, so that's it for this week. I will look forward to seeing you guys next week. Have a good weekend. Have a good rest of the first week, a good week of school starting. And I'll see you guys.
See you.
See you. Take care.
I'm hacking 7.
PM?
Go ahead.
No, that's why would
Why did I wake up to sleep when I was tired? Why did I wake up?
We do.
I know!
Well, it usually hinges, like I said, it goes back to Rousseau. It hinges on the fact that while other animals live in communities, we don't change those communities, whereas we do. Right? And we didn't know ways. So there was a time when humans were in a natural community rather than a cultural community. So the invention of culture, the invention of language, of art, of religion, all those things are what distinguish us from the animals. And all those things, we'll get to it with Hegel, all these things are the way that we objectify our own faculties to ourselves in the way the animals don't. They do have
Yeah.
songs, but they don't have a concept of song. So why is
Yeah.
that? Because
I'm
it actually
right,
doesn't
right?
change.
Yeah.
No.
Or it's in a more entropic way. I mean, actually, birdsong is kind of natural. It's trained. It's passed on. But it tends to modify just based on geographical dispersal rather than based on kind of self-conscious process of like, oh, we're singing. Can we sing differently? What is song? Right?
I guess I need to have a question because what is song if it
You do.
Thank you.
No weird because I feel like they don't know why they change. Because like, is it like they have like equal problems like us? Like they're like, oh, this is fun because this person's singing, this one's singing, and like just disperses out of popularity, which is kind of like is that cultural?
Yeah, it's playful, right. It seems to be cultural, but again, that would be the difference between culture and art. But we'll get there because really it has to do, the claim is that we're like the animals except more so. In other words, we sort of do what the animals do except to another degree, right? So it's not like entirely foreign from what they do because we are animals.
Yeah.
But we do it more than they do it. And that quantity becomes quality, to use a cheesy alien expression.
That was just my dumb little like.
No, it's good.
play off.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, how's it going? Good. Oh, sure, let's do that.
I'll also be attending a Monday class, if that's okay.
Uh-huh. Oh, the Benjamin.
Yes. And I was wondering if I could have access to a semester as a planner. Actually, one of your students I couldn't access the
Oh, it's not there anymore. Okay, or you're not in the canvas anymore? Did it drop you out?
I'm still in, it's just like when I try to connect it with my Google account, it doesn't work.
Oh, that's
So,
weird.
Yeah. I
Because
don't
it
know.
should still be there.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
See you too.
Maybe
Take
it's
care.
because like as a non-enrolled student maybe.
That's possible.
Yeah.
I think the drive that I have it on is my own personal drive, though.
Oh.
So I
is that
wonder,
why?
yeah, but I don't know, it shouldn't have changed, right? So that's the other thing, it shouldn't have changed really.